Hello, this is Mrs. Boots, and we're going to do the quadratic formula practice problems in the quadratic formula lesson. Now, the first three problems just deal with the discriminant. Remember, the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. And that's what we use in every single problem that we're just using the discriminant. It tells us how many solutions and the type. First step, label A, B, and C. A is in front of x squared. B is in front of x, C is the constant. Now we plug it in. I always write my equation without any numbers plugged in, just with parentheses and spaces. Plug in your numbers. B is negative 7, A is 5, C is negative 10. Now we can plug all of this into the calculator, or we can do a little bit of it in our head. So negative 7 squared is 49. 4 times 5, that would be 20. And then times 10 would be 200. 20 times 10 is 200. And it's positive because I have two negatives. So add those two numbers together and you get 249. That's a positive number. Okay, but that is not our answer. Our answer is that because it's positive, we know that we have two real roots. That is the answer we're looking for. How many and what type? Two real roots. Number 2, I need to label A, B, and C. A is with x squared, B is with x, C is my constant. Now I'll put the equation down with parentheses, leaving space to plug in the numbers. B squared minus 4ac. Now let's plug in our numbers. B is 18. Negative 4 times A is 2, times C, which is 81. Wow, those are going to be some big numbers. I'm going to have to use my calculator because I don't have 18 squared memorized. So I plug it in. 18 squared minus 4 times 2 times 81. If you plug it in exactly how you see it, you will get the right answer. You don't have to worry about negative signs and crazy stuff. When I plug that in, I get negative 324. Well, this is a negative number. What do we get when b squared minus 4ac is negative? We get two non-real, or imaginary, it's another way to put it, roots. Two non-real roots. That is my answer for number 2. Number 3. A is in front of x squared. B is in front of x. C is my constant. Now write the equation with parentheses and spaces so we can plug the numbers in. B squared minus 4ac. Now what do we plug in where? B is 9. A is 8. C is 2. Now let's simplify. What is 9 squared? 81. Alright, 4 times 8 is 32. 32 times 2 is 64. Well, 81 minus 64 is 17. That's a positive number, which means we have two real roots. Number 4. Is my quadratic equal to 0? Yes. Awesome. Now I'm going to label A, B, and C. A is in front of x squared. B is in front of x. C is the constant. If there's no number in front of x or x squared, we assume it's a 1. If there's no term for x squared x or the constant, it's assumed to be 0. Now we're going to plug into our quadratic formula. I'm going to write the formula with parentheses, leaving spaces. Negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now we can plug in the values for a, b, and c. So I have negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4 times A times C divided by 2A. Plugging it in. Easy enough. Remember, the first step to simplifying, we simplify the signs in for the front, the denominator, 2 times 1 is 2, and then we find the stuff under the radical. So when I plug in 18 squared minus 4 times 1 times 81, I get 0. Okay, so the square root of 0 is 0. Because I get a nice number there that I can take the square root of, I have to split this into the cases. Why do we split it? Because you cannot use a plus minus button. There's no such thing. So we have to use each specific case. So I have negative 18 plus 0 divided by 2, and negative 18 minus 0 divided by 2. Obviously, we're going to get the same answers here, right? Negative 18 divided by 2 is negative 9. Okay, so my root is at negative 9. That means that my quadratic came down and touched the axis at negative 9. Number 5, is it equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. First, write the equation with parentheses. Now we can plug in our numbers. B is negative 11. So I have a negative 11 plus or minus negative 11 squared minus 4 times A is 1, times C, which is 24, divided by 2 times A, which is 1. Wow. Now we can simplify. Negative and a negative makes a positive. So I have 11 plus minus. There's going to be something under that square root. We'll find it in a second. In the denominator, 2 times 1 is 2. So when I plug in 11 squared minus 4 times 24, I get 25. Well, that's awesome. We can take the square root of 25. It's just 5. So we're going to do a positive case and a negative case. I have 11 plus square root of 25, which is 5, all divided by 2, and 11 minus 5 divided by 2. Now, what's 11 plus 5? 16, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. So one of my roots is at 8. 11 minus 5 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. So my other root is at 3. So my quadratic has roots at 3 and 8, and that's where it goes through the x-axis. Number 6. The first thing I notice is that it is not equal to 0. So I need to move that 30 over to the other side. So my equation is 10x squared minus 5x minus 30 equals to 0. Now it's equal to 0. I can label A, B, and C. Write out the equation. B is negative 5. B squared, 4 times A is 10, times C is negative 30, divided by 2 times A. Crazy huge numbers, but that's okay. Simplify. Negative and a negative is a positive. So I have 5 plus or minus, and the denominator, 2 times 10 is 20. Now, what's under the radical? I'd plug it in a calculator. I know I've got 25, and then that's going to be 40 times 30, which is 1,200. So it's 1,225. I'm going to check and see if that's a perfect square, because I don't have them memorized that high. So I take the square root of 1225. The cool part is, it is a perfect square. So I have 5 plus 35 divided by 20. 5 minus 35 divided by 20. Remember, if I'm getting perfect squares, I could have factored it. Maybe the factoring isn't my thing. Quadratic formula always works, no matter what. So 5 plus 35 is 40. 40 divided by 20 is 2. 2 is one of my roots. 5 minus 35 gives me a negative 30. Divided by 20, that gives me negative 3 over 2. So my roots are at negative 1.5 and positive 2. Number 7. Is my quadratic equal to 0? Yes. Now label A, B, and C. Now write down the formula. Plug in A, B, and C. B is 6. A is 1. C is 3. Now we can simplify it. Okay, negative 6 plus or minus, the denominator would just be a 2. But what goes under the radical? So I have 36 minus 4 times 3. 4 times 3 is 12. 36 minus 12 is 24. 24 is not a perfect square, but we can simplify it. Yes, that means simplifying the radical. So, what is square root 24? Remember, square root 24 is square root 4 times the square root of 6. Square root of 4 is 2, so this would become 2 square root of 6. Well, we can simplify because 6 is divisible by 2 and 2 is divisible by 2. So my answer, if I simplify it, becomes negative 3 plus minus square root 2. That would be the simplest form. Number 8. Is it equal to 0? No. So we have to move that 6 over. So my quadratic is 4x squared plus 5x plus 6 because I subtracted 12 minus 6 is 6. But now it's equal to 0. So I can label A, B, and C. Now let's write out our quadratic. Now let's plug in A, B, and C. B is 5. That's the first thing that gets plugged in. A is 4. C is 6. Make sure you plug in the variables, the numbers, into the correct spot for that variable. Now simplify. Negative 5 plus minus. We're going to have something under the square root, and 2 times 4 in the denominator is 8. So what goes under the radical? So I have 25 minus 4 times 4 times 6. When I plug that in, that ends up being negative 71. Wow, I got a negative under there. Yep. What does that mean? Square root negative 1 equals what? I. So we do need to simplify to indicate that we have an I. 71 is actually a prime number, which means it doesn't break down. So my answer would be negative 5 plus or minus I square root 71, all divided by 8. Number 9. Number 9 looks a little different. Is it equal to 0? Yes, it's equal to 0. Okay, now let's label A, B, and C. B isn't there because there's no x, so B has to be equal to 0. You still write it out, still plug it in. B is 0. That's going to make the calculations easier. A is 3, and C is negative 27. So now let's simplify. I have a 0 out front, plus or minus square root of some stuff. We'll get there in a second. 2 times 3 in the denominator makes 6. Well, what's the stuff? I need negative 4 times 3 times negative 27. That gives me 324. Let's double check and see if that's a perfect square. It turns out it is. Okay, so that means I would have plus 18 over 6 and minus 18 over 6. Yes, you could write that 0 in front, so you could say 0 plus 18 and 0 minus 18. Last time I checked, it's not going to change the answer any. So what is 18 divided by 6? 3. And negative 18 divided by 6 is negative 3. Number 10. Is my quadratic equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. A is negative 3. B is negative 6. C is 10. Okay. Write out the formula. Negative B plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Now let's plug in our numbers. B is negative 6. A is negative 3. C is 10. Now let's simplify. Negative and a negative make a positive. So I have positive 6 plus or minus the square root of something. We'll do that in a second. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Now what's going to be under the radical? When I plug in 6 squared minus 4 times negative 3 times 10, I get 156. 156 is not a perfect square, so I have to break it down. It is, however, divisible by 4. It's the square root of 4 times the square root of 39. I know, I'm crazy for knowing that, but that's okay. So let's simplify. I have 6 plus or minus 2 square roots of 39 divided by negative 6. Now you could simplify further and go ahead and divide, because you notice the 6's will divide. Just make sure you do both. So 6 divided by negative 6 is negative 1. 2 divided by negative 6. Well, since we have a plus minus, we don't have to worry about that, right? We could do a what? 1/3. Okay? Square root 39. If you want to break it up like that, you can, or you can leave it in the 6 plus or minus 2 square root 39 divided by negative 6. Number 11. Is the equation equal to 0? Yes. Now label A, B, and C. A is in front of x squared, B is in front of x, C is the constant. Write out the equation. Now we can plug in our values. B is 5, A is 4, C is negative 9. Now simplify. Out front we have negative 5 plus minus. We have that square root. We're going to leave it alone. 2 times 4 is 8. Now what's under the radical? 5 squared minus 4 times negative 9 gives me 169. 169 is a perfect square. So I can split and find my solutions. Negative 5 plus 13 divided by 8. And then I have negative 5 minus 13 divided by 8. So negative 5 plus 13 is 8. 8 divided by 8 is 1. So one of my solutions is at positive 1. Negative 5 minus 13 is negative 18. So I have negative 18 over 8. We're going to simplify that, and we get negative 9 over 4. Well, if you divide it out, that's that's 2.25, negative 2.25. So we could graph it from there. Number 12, is it equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. Write down your formula. Now we plug in our numbers. B is 10, A is 3, C is 12. Now we can simplify. Alright, negative 10 plus or minus the square root, and 2 times 3 is 6. So what goes under the radical? Turns out it's negative 44. So I have two things I can pull out. The negative becomes I. And square root of 44 is square root of 4 and square root of 11. So my answer is negative 10 plus or minus 2I square root 11 divided by 6. Now 10, 2, and 6 are all divisible by 2. So I need to simplify that. My final answer is negative 5 plus or minus I square root 11 divided by 3. Number 13. Is it equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. Write your equation. So we plug in our numbers. B is negative 28. Please include the signs with the numbers. A is 5 and C is negative 12. Now we can simplify. Negative and a negative make a positive. So I have 28 plus or minus. The denominator is 2 times 5, which is 10. Now what goes under the radical? Well, 28 squared minus 4 times 5 times 12. That ends up being 1024, so 1024. Double check it. Is it a perfect square? Yes, it is. That's awesome. So I have 28 plus 32 divided by 10. And I have 28 minus 32 divided by 10. Remember, you always have a positive case and a negative case. 28 plus 32 is 60, divided by 10 is 6. That's one of my roots. 28 minus 32, well, that's 4. So you end up with negative 2 over 5, because 4 over 10 reduces to 2 over 5. Don't forget your negative sign. Number 14. It's equal to 0. Label A, B, and C. Equation. Now we can plug in A, B, and C. B comes first. Negative 24. Times A, which is 4, times C, negative 108. All over 2A. Now we can simplify. Negative and a negative make a positive. 24. Plus, minus. Well, those are big numbers, so I'm going to wait and plug that in the calculator. 2 times 4 is 8. So now in my calculator, I do 24 squared minus 4 times negative 108, and I get 2,304. I wonder if that's a perfect square. It turns out that it is. The square root of 2,304 is 48. So I have two cases. 24 plus 48 divided by 8, and 24 minus 48 divided by 8. Okay, so 24 minus 48 is negative 24. Divide that by 8, I get negative 3. So that's one of my roots. 24 plus 48? What is that? That's 72. 72 divided by 8 is 9. So one of my roots is at 9 and the other one is at negative 3. Number 15. Is it equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. Write the equation. What is B? Negative 16. Minus 4 times A, 1, times C, 64, divided by 2A. Now we can simplify. Negative and a negative make a positive. So I have positive 16, and in the denominator, 2 times 1 is 2. Let's figure out what goes under the radical. 16 squared minus 4 times 64. Well, it ends up being 0. We had one of those cases before, right? What happens? What's the square root of 0? Well, the square root of 0 equals 0. So I have two cases, right? 16 plus 0 divided by 2 and 16 minus 0 divided by 2. They end up being the exact same thing. 16 divided by 2 is 8. So I have a double root at 8. That means my quadratic comes down and touches the axis at 8. Number 16. Is it equal to 0? Yes. Label A, B, and C. Write out the equation. Now we plug in our numbers. B is 8. A is 1. C, negative 20. Now we can simplify. If negative 8 plus or minus the square root of something, we'll figure it out, all divided by 2. Now what's the something? 8 squared minus 4 times negative 20 actually gives me 144. I actually recognize that number. It is a perfect square. Square root of 144 equals 12. So I can plug in a 12. So negative 8 plus 12 divided by 2, and negative 8 minus 12 divided by 2. Negative 8 plus 12 gives me a positive 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. One of my roots is at 2. Negative 8 minus 12 is negative 20. Negative 20 divided by 2 is negative 10. So the other root is at negative 10. Number 17. Is it equal to 0? No. So we have to move the negative 3 over to the other side. We move it by adding it. So I now have 3x squared plus 30x plus 3 equals to 0. Now I can label my A, B, and C. Now let's write the formula. B is 30. A is 3. Ironically, C is 3. Negative 30 plus or minus, we'll figure that out in a second, all divided by 2 times 3, which is 6. The stuff under the radical, 30 squared minus 4 times 3 times 3, that ends up being 936. Check and see if it's a perfect square. Nope, it's not. Let's try and divide it by a perfect square. So we're going to break it down. The square root of 936 is also the square root of 36 times the square root of 26. Well, the square root of 36 is 6. So we can break it down to 30 plus minus 6 square root 26, all divided by 6. Lots of 6's in there. Remember, you can simplify. But you have to divide both the 30 and the 6 in front of the radical by the 6 on the bottom. That will give us negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 26. Number 18. Is my function equal to 0? No. I need to move the 11 over. That means subtracting 11. Okay? So my equation becomes x squared minus 12x plus 9 equals to 0. Now that it's equal to 0, I can actually label A, B, and C. Let's write down the equation. Now plug in your numbers. Negative B. B is negative 12. A is 1. C is 9. Now simplify. Negative 12 is positive 12. Plus or minus, we'll do the square root in a minute. 2 times 1 is 2. So 12 squared minus 4 times 9 is 108. I can double check it and take the square root of 108, but it's not a perfect square. However, 108 is divisible by 36. So 108 is the square root of 36 and the square root of 3. The square root of 36 is 6. So I have 12 plus or minus 6 square root 3, all divided by 2. Yes, we can divide by that too and get it even simpler, and that's what we want to do. So 12 divided by 2 is 6, plus or minus 6 divided by 2, which is 3, square root 3.